Before there was swimwear, there was knitwear. I don't know if that's actually true, but let's go with it. Recently, I saw Margot Robbie play a giant lady in a teaser for what I initially thought was a sequel to The Big Short. You know, that movie about the 2008 housing market crash. But it actually turned out to be the upcoming Barbie movie. Good thing plastic dream houses are way more affordable. Oh wait, never mind. Anyway, I had some serious questions, like what's with the swimsuit? Why does it look like that? And why isn't it pink? Of course, I had to look it up. And it turned out that this ensemble was the very first outfit that Barbie ever wore. Upon closer inspection, I realized that the original bathing suit was in fact made with a striped knit fabric. This was a pretty big deal. I was already in the middle of a totally unrelated project, but the curiosity that pushed me down this rabbit hole had ultimately led to a prison cell, where I was held captive by my own creative fixation. The irony was that the only thing that could free me were the black and white stripes. Speaking of which, I had already stumbled at the first hurdle. It was a kerfuffle, or kerfumble if you will. I wanted to make this swimsuit out of cotton because despite the lack of stretch, it's still one of the more appropriate fibers aquatically speaking. This alone ruled out using wool because of how much water it absorbs. That, and I only had access to it in either off-white or cream. Acrylic was somewhere in between. It wasn't the best in water, but is stretchy and does exist in the right colors. Obviously, there are other fibers and yarn types, including elastane blends, but in the words of collective internet mom, we have food at home. Bone apple teeth. So naturally, I prioritized using up what I already had and started by swatching the cotton. Seeing as I only had both colors in a sports weight, I was worried that the resulting suit might not hold up too well, this being a strapless one piece and all. So I doubled it up to make a DK/Aran weight equivalent. In an attempt to save time, via the art of wasting time, I cast on a mere 7 stitches on 4mm needles to get an idea of where this was all going. I don't think I'm a fan. On second thought, it's not so bad. It was a mixed reception, to say the least. This swatching process was long-winded and somewhat convoluted, and although there is always material reality to blame, my questionable logic, as a result of my eager excitement, was the real culprit. But that was nothing. The real kicker was that after all of this back and forth, I ended up circling back to square one. No matter how much optimism I threw at it, the stiffness of the fabric was just too high risk for this type of garment. The potential need to insert a zipper, coupled with having to deal with doubled up yarn, simply wasn't worth it. That was it. I gave up. I am not a Barbie girl, nor are we living in a Barbie world. Life in plastic, generally speaking, is not fantastic. But this was not the best option, and I really wanted to use up my existing acrylic yarn. I'm pretty sure that's in the lyrics somewhere. The acrylic option was probably the closest I was going to get to the original material, so it was a plus in that sense. However, the swatching saga wasn't over yet, because despite being the same weight, these two yarns were completely different in every other way possible. So I had to make sure that they worked together tension-wise. All of a sudden, I was confronted with the reality that I had to decide how this swimsuit was going to be constructed, and quickly. Unfortunately, it wasn't as straightforward as it first seemed. You see, it was clear that the original Barbie outfit had been cut from a striped jersey knit and sewn together both at the center front and at the bottom to form the crotch. The chevron effect was a result of the diagonal cut of the stripes. There were also the 2 seams at the bust, which were either darts or pleats. It was difficult to tell. Either way, after mentally deconstructing the suit into a flat pattern, I ended up with a sorry-looking image of a headless and likely flightless butterfly. I also realized soon enough that trying to knit the shape in one flat piece might not be the best option for a multitude of reasons. The biggest one being that it would be near impossible to see how it all fit until seaming it together at the very end. So, instead, I considered knitting it in the round in 2 main parts, one from the waist up and the second from the waist down, which, although had its downsides, also had some pretty crucial advantages. Things will get clearer, I promise. Luckily, the 2 yarns worked together well enough on 4mm needles, and the stretch was giving the type of encouragement that one wistfully reminisces about in adulthood. In other words, it felt like a shiny gold star. So, as per usual, I used my swatch tension to calculate the number of stitches needed for the waist, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? Except, why is it that almost, if not every single time I actually go by my swatch tension, I end up with this? The math is not mathing. It never has, and clearly never will. I have simply come to the conclusion that the physics engine is broken, and I expect whoever is responsible to fix this glitch in the matrix. After unraveling and casting on considerably fewer stitches, I finally progressed to my first color change, and things were looking up once again. Multiple centered make one increases later, and there was enough fabric to try on, although I probably should have used a longer cable before doing so. The thing with color work is that it's all fun and games until you're suddenly confronted with a tangled mess of yarns that remind you, despite what Jennifer Lopez's 2001 hit Love Don't Cost a Thing would have us believe, that nothing in life actually comes for free, but perhaps, more accurately, the detwisting is more like the reverse concept of a wind-up toy, and I think I prefer the original version, because this was giving more punishment than reward. Speaking of toys, I decided, admittedly a little too late in the game, to do some more research into this garment. And what I found was, for lack of a better term, somewhat scandalous. In a nutshell, the first Barbie was actually based on the initially not so family-friendly doll from Germany, Bild Lilly. Now, if you were to look at both dolls side by side, you can really see the resemblance, and it might even seem like a reach to believe that one was a spicy comic strip character marketed towards grown men as a quote, gag gift at bachelor parties, and the other made for little girls to project themselves onto. I'll leave you to consider the implications, good or bad, significant or not. Honestly, I don't really see what's wrong with a doll's waist measuring less than its head circumference. After all, shouldn't we encourage the future generations to grow big and beautiful brains? I mean, think about it. Anyway, with all this thinking taking up so much mental capacity, I ended up overshooting past the point of my first cast off. So I laboriously unraveled stitch by stitch before marking out a line on what would be the back of the garment not far above the waist. There was no technical reason to be so meticulous about it, I just wasn't emotionally prepared to pull everything off the needles for nothing more than a couple of rounds. After the initial cast off, remember to always work 2 stitches past the first marker before casting off, I had essentially broken the round, and it was time to continue casting off at each end using the sloped cast-off method. This method is when you leave the last stitch untouched and lift it over the first worked stitch in the next row. This leaves you with a smooth curve that's perfect for necklines, sleeves, armholes, etc. I then put my progress on the stand because it was a lot easier than checking the fit on myself. At this point, I was truly pleasantly surprised. So the increases at the front have actually worked a lot better than I thought they had. And as you can see from the side profile, it's much higher than the back. Although it made sense in theory, I wasn't entirely sure if the increases would give the desired effect, and it was just a great feeling that they did. Nevertheless, if experience serves me right, this was not the time to get overly confident, because it's usually around about this stage where something just jumps out of the blue and smacks me in the fit. Yep, there it is. The first problem was that one of my sloped cast-off stitches was just way too loose, and left a big hole, like the one I didn't need in my head. And the other one is that I'm still carrying the black yarn here, but I kind of need it to be over here. At this point, I kind of wish that I just worked flat, although I also wouldn't have some of the perks of working in the round, so I guess it just evens out really.
We lost one.
Like I said, I couldn't help but think about all the positives working flat would have had relative to my current situation, now that I knew what I knew. And I even considered starting all over again. But there was no guarantee that it would be a better option overall, and there was still the possibility of getting to the end, stitching it all together, only to realize that I actually preferred my current in the round method. I've kind of figured it out, and I'm going to just carry the black yarn the whole time. The sunk cost fallacy had me in a chokehold, but it wasn't like I was fighting it. it was time to tackle the hardest, or rather the least certain part of the top half, which was vital for shaping the garment and giving it the angle stripe detailing. So now what I have to do is I have to basically create two ears on top of this center part here, and that I'll be able to fold downwards so that it creates a dart at the side here. I'm a bit worried that the fabric might end up a bit too thick, which is why I'm going with the dart method. I'll be honest, I don't know if this will work or not, but in theory it should, and I can't really think of why it wouldn't work out, but again, I'm just gonna do it and see what happens. With tasks like these, I often find that trying something unknown can sometimes lead to rushing things. Like, I just want to get it done to see if it works or not. The sooner the better. But I'd like to work on still enjoying the knitting process while also looking forward to the outcome, regardless of whether or not it ends up working out. At least there's always next time. So this is one of the ears. The idea is that I attach these two sides together, and that leaves me with a straight edge at the top. Now I just need to do the same with this side, and then I can put it all together. Apparently, I was so excited to see if this method worked that I even forgot to tie off the end. All that was left was to replicate the same thing on the other side. Now that I finished the top, I actually want to leave it and I don't want to stitch it together yet. I know it's probably a good idea to actually finish this off and see how it looks, but I really don't want to, just in case it doesn't work out. I guess it's like a little halter neck top. Cute. Everything was as straightforward as it gets. Working from the waist down was just like working from the waist up, except it was longer. The center front increases in the opposite direction helped to create a downward point in the stripes, resembling the original. It had been a while, so to make sure that everything was fitting properly, I did a quick fit check. Although the cable kind of got in the way of seeing how the knit actually behaved, it was looking promising, and I knew the stretch gave me some leeway, even if it turned out a little shorter than intended. Judging from the multiple swimsuit doll references I looked at, there didn't seem to be a clear stripe continuity. Some dolls had more stripes than others, and the colours weren't always in the same places. That being said, I wanted to be as aesthetically faithful as possible, so I tried to go with the most common pattern I could find. With all aspects as close to ideal as I was going to get them, I then cut the cord and began binding off with a generic cast-off. I didn't think to capture what happened next, because it all happened so quickly. Basically, somehow, it ended up being too small. And to add insult to injury, it was at that precise moment that I discovered that upside-down muffin tops, or rather reverse muffin bottoms, existed. I won't say any more than that, as I'm sure you can figure out the logistics in your own time. But do you really want to? The only way to redeem my faith in this process was to frog and think up another way to move forward, while also forgetting the best part of the last hour. I'm going to use the stretchy cast off. This is all the yarn I just unraveled, so let's just hope it doesn't get too tangled. To make the stretchy cast off, or sewn bind off as you may already know it by, I basically took 2 steps forward. Honestly, if this goes wrong, it's going to be so difficult to undo. And 1 step back, taking the last stitch off the needle. That's if left is forward and not back for you, if that makes sense. I had a not-so-sneaking suspicion that the unraveled cast-off left me with a laughable excess in length, but nonetheless, the irrational fear of cutting off too much was enough for me to do absolutely nothing about it. Eventually, and I really mean eventually, I had completed the entire round and was left with a generous yarn end. So even though nobody, including myself, asked, it turns out that the knit cast-off uses up way more than its sewn counterpart, which kind of begs the question, other than it being the first one most people learn and by no means the easiest, why do we use the knit cast-off so much? On a complete 180, I decided to include a feature that is different to the original and potentially the movie too, which is often referred to as a crotch clasp. Since the yarn fibre pretty much ruled out the swim aspect for me, I figured it could still be worn as a bodysuit that could be layered, and a snap fastening would naturally be the more functional option. This is the front panel, and this is the back. So I decided to knit the front and back part separately and sew poppers onto each end, at the end. Now I'm going to stitch the top together, and I put it on the stand just because I wanted to show you. It is a little smaller than the original, although I do think I actually prefer it this way. Once the edges are finished, it will look a little bit wider and hopefully fit a little better as well. And I forgot to mention, I'm using the mattress stitch, but it's one vertical, one horizontal. You can see how it's shaped the garment already. Nice. I wasn't expecting to enjoy the process and like the results as much as I did, and part of me almost regretted not seaming earlier. I just had to replicate the same success on the other side. Okay, finally done with the top, and now all that's left to do is to finish off the edges because they are looking a little raw. But instead of starting with the very top because it's a giant circle, I'm going to start off with one side of the leg opening. And dear, oh dear, the I-cord turned into a complete disaster. Sure, I could make it smaller by casting on fewer stitches, but I had a feeling I would regret it sooner or later. It just didn't seem like it would be comfortable. I think I might have to switch to ribbing. And that's exactly what I did. Obviously, to finish the rib, I would use a tubular cast-off method. It took a moment to get used to the stitch sequence again, but it didn't take long. The last time I used it was for my Devil Wears Prada inspired sweater, and don't tell anyone, but I rewatched my own video to refresh my memory. One would think that replicating this on the other side would be a breeze at this point, and they'd be right. Except...
Are you for real?
As much as I tried to console and convince myself that this was no big deal, and that I should simply embrace this quirky, more like silly, handmade imperfection, I had it, and there was no way I was going to allow this one stitch to continue to cross the line both literally and figuratively. Everything was once again right with the world. Well, that's pushing it, but the problem was finally fixed. The tubular cast-off had become second nature, and I was finally able to just enjoy the small, though important, task. This was very much needed, because I knew all too well what was coming next. Another I-cord. Not just your run-of-the-mill I-cord attempt. The thing is, I had never seen this done before, so although it definitely already existed somewhere, and couldn't be more straightforward in theory, I didn't know if it would work out for sure. But nonetheless, you know what they say, you've got to f*** around to find out. I've just started my I-cord, and it was going well until I reached this point. Already I was faced with what felt like an insurmountable challenge. There was simply too much going on all at once, but so help me I was going to finish what I had only just started, and make my first colour change. I'm really pleasantly surprised. Before I knew it, the not-so-sweet tangled licorice had returned, and with a high twist to cord length ratio, it was by far the most extreme case yet. Ta-da! You know, I really didn't think I would end up with this many yarn ends. Well, you know how this part goes. Why there's still a needle attached to this? I honestly don't know.
It is time.
Since the I-cord was as hollow as a plastic doll, I thought it would be a good idea to insert some elastic through it to help with the overall fit of the strapless bodysuit. And I think it's safe to say that this part probably wasn't required for the original. I mean, talk about hard bodies, literally hard plastic ones. Though, let's be real, a non-elasticated garment was no match for this soft and squishy one. The last part was sewing in the popper fastenings, and that was it. Now to see if it really and truly fit. I can't quite believe how much I actually like how this turned out. The fit worked out in the end, despite the worry of it not being long enough. I think it's safe to say that switching from the cotton yarn in the beginning probably saved this project. I really hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks for watching.